take a slow breath. Let the world around you fade a little, the hum of your room, the quiet of the night, the rhythm of your heartbeat. Wherever you are, under soft lamplight, wrapped in blankets, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, let yourself settle. Now, picture this. An immense frozen plain stretches out before you. The air is sharp and clean and heavy with silence. No lights, no roads, no cities, just the raw pulse of the wild. The sun hangs low on the horizon, painting long shadows across untouched snow. You stand at the edge of a world that hasn't yet learned your name. This is Earth, 100,000 years ago. The Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, a time before history, before myth, before memory. And yet, this was home, our home. Your ancestors walked this world, the same species, the same spark behind their eyes. From their fires would come the first art, the first stories, the long thread that leads all the way to you watching this right now. But here's where the story begins to twist into wonder. We weren't alone. Before we go further, tell me something. Down in the comments, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how this moment connects us. People scattered across the planet sharing one quiet journey through time together. Now let's begin. 100,000 years ago, we shared this planet with 5 other human species. 6 kinds of human beings, walking the earth at the same time. 6 different answers to the question of what it means to be human. They hunted, they made fire, they buried their dead, they loved and grieved and wondered at the stars just as you do now. Let that settle for a moment. 6. There were the Neanderthals, of course. Broad-shouldered, powerful, thriving across Europe and Western Asia. There were the Denisovans, mysterious cousins we know mostly through fragments and DNA, spread across the vastness of Asia. There were Homo erectus, the great survivors, who had already walked the earth for nearly 2 million years by this point, still clinging to existence in isolated pockets of Southeast Asia. There were the diminutive Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Flores Island, barely a metre tall but clever and resourceful. There were the enigmatic Homo naledi in southern Africa, whose story we're only beginning to piece together. And there were the Red Deer Cave people of China, a population so recently discovered we're still debating whether they represent a distinct species or something else entirely. 6 reflections of the human form, 6 variations on the theme of consciousness and tool use and culture, 6 branches on a family tree that have been growing, diverging, experimenting with different ways of being human for millions of years, and then, gradually across the span of 90,000 years, a geological eye blink but longer than all of recorded history, 5 of them disappeared. Only we remained. Why? That's not a simple question, and it doesn't have a simple answer, but it's the question that haunts every archaeological dig, every carefully brushed bone fragment, every stone tool turned over in a researcher's hand. What happened? What did we have that they didn't? Or perhaps more unsettlingly, what did we do? But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This isn't just a story about extinction. It's not a mystery to be solved in the next 10 minutes with a neat conclusion and a satisfied nod. This is something slower, something richer. This is an invitation to inhabit a world, to really feel what it was like to be alive when the outcome wasn't yet determined, when our species was just one thread in a tapestry of human possibility, not yet knowing we'd be the last thread left. Tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, wherever and whenever you are, we're going to walk together through that world. We're going to step into the daily existence of Paleolithic peoples, not just the dramatic moments, the hunts, the conflicts, the big evolutionary turning points, but the textures of ordinary life, the way firelight feels on your face after a long day, the smell of hide being cured, the sound of stone striking stone as someone shapes a hand axe with practiced, patient skill, the taste of wild honey, rare and precious, the particular quality of silence in a world with no machines, no engines, no hum of electricity. We're going to explore what they knew, the profound intelligence required to survive in a world that offered no guarantees, no safety nets, no stored surplus to fall back on when times got hard. We'll look at their tools, their art, their evidence of abstract thought and symbolic meaning. We'll piece together, as best we can from the fragments they left behind, what a single day might have looked and felt and sounded like. This is a meditation as much as it is a history, a slow immersion into deep time. Because here's what strikes me most powerfully about this period. These people, all 6 species of them, were living fully realised lives. They weren't primitive sketches waiting for us to come along and finish the drawing. They were complete. They had knowledge we've lost, skills we'll never recover, ways of reading the landscape, of understanding animal behaviour, of navigating by stars and seasons and the subtle signs of coming weather that would seem like magic to most of us today. They survived ice ages. They crossed continents. They raised children in conditions that would break most of us in days. They created beauty for its own sake, not because it helped them survive, but because something in the human spirit even then demanded it, and almost all of them vanished. The story of 100,000 years ago is a story of survival, yes, of ingenuity and adaptation, and the raw determination to persist against impossible odds. But it's also a story of loss, of roads not taken, of voices that fell silent, of all the different ways there might have been to be human, and how all but one of those ways slipped into darkness. So settle in. Let the world you know fade a little around the edges. We have a long journey ahead, back through time, yes, but also into questions that still echo in the present. Questions about who we are, about what we've carried forward from that ancient world, hidden in our genes and our behaviours and our deepest instincts, about what we've forgotten and whether we should try to remember. The fire is lit, the night is long, and the story is just beginning. Let's step back together into the world before memory. 100,000 years ago, you wouldn't have been alone. Not alone as a species, I mean. Not alone in the way we are today, singular, solitary, the only human mind looking up at the stars with questions we can actually speak aloud. No. 100,000 years ago, the world was crowded with humanity, different humanities, plural, and that changes everything about how we understand what it meant to be alive back then. Picture the planet as it was, not empty, not waiting for us to fill it, but already occupied, carved up into territories and ranges, into valleys held by one kind of human, and coastlines walked by another. From the frozen edges of Europe to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, from the highlands of Tibet to the dense forests of Java, human beings lived and hunted and raised children and buried their dead. But they weren't all us. They were our kindred, our cousins, some close enough that we could, and did, have children together, others so distant, so diverged from our own evolutionary path, that meeting them would have felt like encountering something from another world entirely. This is the story of who they were. Let's start with ourselves. Homo sapiens. That's us. Anatomically modern humans. And 100,000 years ago, we were largely confined to Africa and parts of the Middle East. We'd been around for maybe 200,000 years by that point, though the dating gets murky depending on which fossils you count as fully modern and which you classify as something just before us. But here's the thing. We weren't special yet. Not obviously. Not in any way that would have seemed destined for global dominance. We were just another hominin species trying to survive. We made stone tools, yes, clever ones, refined ones. We probably had language, though we can't be certain how complex it was. We lived in small groups, maybe a few dozen individuals at most, moving across landscapes in search of food and water and shelter. We were smart, adaptable, creative, but so were the others. And by others, I mean at least 5 other human species we know existed at that time. 5 confirmed lineages, each with their own evolutionary history stretching back hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years. 5 other ways of being human. Let's meet them. First, the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, the most famous of our extinct cousins, and for good reason. They were everywhere. Well, everywhere that mattered in the northern hemisphere. Their range stretched from the Atlantic coast of Portugal all the way across Europe, through the Middle East, and deep into Central Asia. For nearly 300,000 years they were the humans of Ice Age Europe, and they were built for it. Neanderthals were stocky, shorter than most modern humans, but incredibly robust, barrel-chested, thick-boned. Their bodies were compact and muscular, designed to conserve heat in the brutal cold of glacial winters. Their skulls were elongated with prominent brow ridges and a sloping forehead. Their noses were broad, an adaptation for warming and humidifying frigid air before it reached their lungs. But don't mistake their different anatomy for simplicity. Don't fall into that old Victorian trap of imagining them as dim-witted brutes. Neanderthals were smart. They made sophisticated tools, stone blades and points that required not just strength but planning, precision, knowledge passed down through generations. They controlled fire. They built shelters. They hunted large game like mammoths and woolly rhinos, dangerous, intelligent prey that required coordination, strategy, communication. They cared for their sick and injured. We found Neanderthal skeletons with healed fractures, with signs of disabilities that would have required others to support them, to feed them, to keep them alive when they couldn't fend for themselves. They buried their dead. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that it seems deliberate, ritual, meaningful. There are Neanderthal graves with bodies carefully positioned, sometimes with tools or animal bones placed alongside them. They made art, or something like it. We found shells with pigment traces suggesting they painted or decorated themselves. We found eagle talons with wear patterns that indicate they were strung together, perhaps as jewellery, perhaps as symbols of status or identity. And they had culture, regional variations in tool styles that suggest different groups had different traditions, different ways of doing things that they taught to their children and maintained over generations. 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals weren't a dying species. They were thriving. They were the dominant humans across vast swaths of the old world. They had mastered their environment in ways we were only beginning to attempt. If you'd been an observer back then, some kind of time-travelling anthropologist placing bets on which human lineage would inherit the Earth, Neanderthals would have seemed like a pretty safe wager. But then there were the others, the ones we're only just beginning to understand, the Denisovans, Homo denisova, or maybe they don't deserve their own species name yet. The taxonomy is still disputed, still evolving as we learn more, but for simplicity, let's call them Denisovans. They're ghosts in the fossil record, shadows revealed mostly through DNA. Here's what we know. In 2008, archaeologists working in Denisova cave in Siberia found a tiny finger bone, a child's pinky, about 40,000 years old. When they sequenced the DNA, they discovered something extraordinary. It wasn't Homo sapiens. It wasn't Neanderthal. It was something else. something that had diverged from our common ancestor more than 500,000 years ago that had been living and evolving in parallel to both us and the Neanderthals all that time. Since then, we've found a few more fragments, a jawbone in Tibet, some teeth, a skull piece so small you could lose it in your pocket. Not much, certainly not enough to fully reconstruct what they looked like, but their DNA is everywhere. It shows up in modern populations across Asia, Oceania and Australia. Some indigenous Australians and Melanesians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, more archaic ancestry than most Europeans have Neanderthal. And that DNA tells stories. It tells us that Denisovans were widespread across Asia, that they lived in environments ranging from the freezing heights of the Tibetan Plateau to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, that they interbred with our ancestors multiple times in multiple places, creating genetic echoes that persist in billions of people alive today. Some of that Denisovan DNA is still functional, still doing something useful. There's a gene variant carried by Tibetans that helps them live at high altitudes without getting sick from lack of oxygen. A Denisovan gift, passed down through tens of thousands of years, still helping people survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But who were they? What did they look like? How did they live? We don't know. Not really. The fossil record is too sparse, too fragmentary. They remain mysterious, present in our genes but absent from our understanding, like a melody you can hear but can't quite place. 100,000 years ago, they were out there, in the mountains, in the caves, living lives we can barely imagine. And then there were the ancient ones, the survivors of older ages, Homo erectus. This is a species that deserves your respect, your awe even. Homo erectus first appeared in Africa nearly 2 million years ago. 2 million. Let that settle for a moment. While Homo sapiens have been around for maybe 300,000 years, and behaviourally modern for much less than that, Homo erectus endured for more than 1.5 million years. They were the first humans to leave Africa, the first to master fire, the first to spread across the old world, adapting to environments from the Mediterranean to China to the islands of Indonesia. And 100,000 years ago, some of them were still around. On the island of Java, in what is now Indonesia, Homo erectus populations persisted long after their relatives had evolved into other species or gone extinct. The youngest fossils we've found date to somewhere between 110,000 and 50,000 years ago, meaning they were contemporaries of early Homo sapiens, of Neanderthals, of Denisovans. They were living fossils, echoes of an earlier age. Homo erectus were taller than Neanderthals, but not as robustly built. Their skulls were thick-boned, with prominent brow ridges and a brain case smaller than ours, about 2/3 the size. But don't let that fool you into thinking they were simple. They made sophisticated stone tools. They hunted large animals. They crossed open water to reach islands, something that requires planning, craft building, the ability to conceive of a destination you can't see from shore. They survived ice ages and volcanic eruptions and climate swings that would have wiped out less adaptable species. For 1.5 million years they endured, but 100,000 years ago they were on the edge, isolated on Java, cut off from the mainland, the last of their kind, holding on in a corner of the world that had once been the centre of their range. How aware were they of their own rarity? Did they know, in whatever way such knowledge is possible, that they were the end of a lineage stretching back into the deepest mists of prehistory? We'll never know. But they were there, walking the same earth we walked, breathing the same air, and on other islands other humans had emerged, stranger ones, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Flores Island. Discovered in 2003 in Liangboa Cave, these tiny humans stood barely over 3 feet tall. Their brains were the size of a chimpanzee's, about a third the volume of ours, and yet they made stone tools, controlled fire, hunted cooperatively. They lived on Flores for tens of thousands of years, maybe longer. Their fossils date back at least 100,000 years, possibly much further, and they were perfectly adapted to their island home. Island dwarfism is a well-known evolutionary phenomenon. When large animals become isolated on islands with limited resources, natural selection favours smaller body sizes, less food required, faster reproductive maturity. Elephants shrink, hippos shrink, humans shrink. And that's apparently what happened on Flores. Some population of earlier humans, maybe Homo erectus, maybe something else, became stranded there, and over hundreds of thousands of years they evolved into something new, something small. But they thrived. The island had pygmy elephants, stegodon, about the size of a cow, and giant rats and Komodo dragons. Homo floresiensis hunted the elephants, leaving butchered bones and stone tools in cave deposits. They had their own world, their own evolutionary trajectory, their own way of being human that had nothing to do with bigger brains or taller bodies. 100,000 years ago, they were there, on their island, living lives utterly unlike any other humans anywhere, and they weren't the only island humans. In 2007, archaeologists working in Calao Cave in the Philippines found teeth and finger bones belonging to yet another species, Homo luzonensis. The fossils are at least 50,000 years old, possibly much older, and they show a strange mix of features, some primitive, some more modern, all blended together in ways that don't fit neatly into our evolutionary tree. Their teeth are small and simple. Their fingers are curved, suited for climbing. Their feet show a mix of traits suggesting they walked upright, but maybe not in quite the same way we do. And the fact that they were on Luzon at all is significant. Luzon is an island. It has been separated from the Asian mainland for millions of years. There's no land bridge, no way to walk there during low sea levels, which means that at some point, whether deliberately or accidentally, some population of archaic humans crossed open ocean and colonized that island. Did they build boats, rafts, or did they drift there on natural debris after storms? We don't know, but they made it. And they survived there long enough to become their own distinct species, with their own unique anatomy. 100,000 years ago, they were probably already there, living in the forests, making tools, raising children who would never see the mainland their ancestors once came from. 6 species, 6 lineages, 6 ways of being human, all existing at the same time. Homo sapiens in Africa, Neanderthals across Europe and Asia, Denisovans in the highlands and caves of the east, Homo erectus on Java, Homo floresiensis on Flores, Homo luzonensis on Luzon. But here's the thing, there were probably more. The fossil record is maddeningly incomplete. We've explored maybe a tiny fraction of the caves, valleys and river deposits where ancient bones might be preserved. Every few years someone finds something new, something unexpected, something that forces us to redraw the family tree. In 2021, researchers announced the discovery of Homo longi, dragon man, from a skull found in China. The dating is uncertain, the classification disputed, but if it's a distinct species, it's one we had no idea existed until a construction worker stumbled across a fossil decades ago. There are other fossils that don't fit neatly anywhere. A jaw from Taiwan, fragmentary remains from caves in Asia, genetic hints in modern DNA that suggest interbreeding with populations we haven't identified yet. Every discovery is a reminder. We don't know everything. We probably don't know most things. The world was big. The population of humans, all species combined, was tiny. Maybe a few 100,000 individuals scattered across 3 continents, and dozens of islands. Most of them lived and died without leaving a trace we'll ever find. So when I say there were 6 human species 100,000 years ago, understand that's a minimum, a conservative estimate. The real number could be higher, perhaps much higher. Try to imagine what that world felt like. Not the mechanics of survival, we'll get to that, but the emotional weight, the strangeness. Imagine walking through a forest in what is now France, and in the distance you see smoke, a campfire. You approach cautiously and you see them, people, but not quite like you. Stockier, different faces, different eyes, Neanderthals. Do you feel kinship, curiosity, fear? They speak, but you don't understand the words. They gesture. Maybe you trade, a tool for some meat, an exchange that transcends language. Or maybe you fight. Maybe territories overlap and resources are too scarce to share. Maybe you interbreed. Fall in love, if such a thing is possible across species lines. Have children who are something in between, carrying DNA from 2 divergent lineages into the future. This happened. We know it happened. The genetic evidence is undeniable. Modern humans outside Africa carry Neanderthal DNA, about 1–2% of our genome. Some populations carry Denisovan DNA too. These aren't just traces of ancient contact. They're functional genes, still active, still influencing everything from immune response to skin colour to altitude adaptation. We're hybrids, all of us who aren't purely African in ancestry. We're the blended descendants of at least 3, possibly more, distinct human lineages, which raises a question: how different were they really? If Neanderthals and Denisovans could have viable offspring with Homo sapiens, children who survived and reproduced, were they truly separate species? Biologically, the lines blur. The old definition of species, groups that can't interbreed, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Lions and tigers can produce offspring, wolves and dogs, Neanderthals and humans. The boundaries are fuzzy, permeable, but phenomenologically, in terms of lived experience, they were different. Different bodies, different faces, different ways of thinking perhaps, different cultures, different languages, different ways of organising the world. The human world of 100,000 years ago was diverse in a way it has never been since, and that brings us to the question at the heart of this entire story. Why did that diversity collapse? Today, there's only us, Homo sapiens, alone. Every other human lineage is extinct, gone. What happened? It's not a simple question, and it doesn't have a simple answer. Some of it was probably environmental. Climate change, not the kind we're causing now, but the natural oscillations of ice ages and warming periods, shifted habitats, altered food sources, made some regions uninhabitable. Species with small, isolated populations are always vulnerable to extinction. One bad drought, one volcanic eruption, one particularly harsh winter. Some of it was probably competition. When 2 species occupy the same niche, one usually wins, not through direct conflict necessarily, though that may have happened, but through slow generational attrition. One group reproduces slightly faster, uses resources slightly more efficiently, adapts slightly better to changing conditions. Over thousands of years, those small advantages compound, and some of it was absorption. Neanderthals didn't just disappear, they became us, or part of us. The same with Denisovans. If the populations were small enough and interbreeding common enough, distinct lineages could blend together until the lines between them vanished. But here's what we know for certain. By about 40,000 years ago, most of the other human species were gone. Neanderthals lingered until perhaps 30,000 years ago in isolated pockets. Homo floresiensis might have survived until 50,000 years ago. Homo erectus probably vanished even earlier, but 100,000 years ago they were all still there, all still walking the earth, all still living, breathing, thinking, feeling. And in the sections ahead, we'll explore the world they inhabited, the landscapes and climates, the animals and plants, the technologies and tools they used to survive. But first, I wanted you to meet them, to understand that the Paleolithic wasn't just one story. It was many stories, many lineages, many minds experiencing the world in ways both familiar and alien to us. We are their descendants, their cousins, in some cases literally their children, carrying fragments of their DNA in every cell of our bodies. They aren't footnotes to our story. We're all chapters in a much larger story, one that began millions of years ago in Africa and branched out across the world in 100 different directions, most of which ended in silence. But one, our thread, endured. And understanding why requires understanding the world as it was. Ice and fire, stone and sky, a planet in flux, and the humans, all the humans, trying to survive it. Let's go there now. Now, to understand the lives of those who walked 100,000 years ago, we need to step into their world. And what a world it was. Picture this. You wake before dawn, not in a bed, not in a room with walls and a ceiling. You wake on the ground, on a mat of dried grass and animal hides, in a shelter barely substantial enough to be called a structure. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe. Your lungs burn with each inhalation. Frost has formed on the fur wrapped around your shoulders, frost from your own breath while you slept. You emerge into a landscape that would break the modern mind with its scale and its emptiness. This is the Pleistocene. This is the Ice Age. And this is where they lived. When we say Ice Age, we're speaking of a period that lasted roughly 2.6 million years. A vast stretch of time marked not by constant freezing but by cycles. Glacial periods, when ice sheets advanced across continents, alternating with interglacial periods, brief warm intervals when the ice retreated and forests reclaimed the land. 100,000 years ago, we're entering one of these glacial periods, specifically the early part of what scientists call marine isotope stage 5, transitioning toward a colder phase. The Earth is transforming. Ice sheets, kilometres thick in places, cover much of northern Europe, northern Asia and North America. These aren't the tidy glaciers we see in nature documentaries today. These are continent-consuming rivers of ice, grinding, carving, reshaping the very bones of the planet. Sea levels drop by more than 100 metres as water locks itself into ice. Coastlines extend far beyond where they sit today. Entire land bridges emerge from the sea, Beringia connecting Asia to North America, Sunderland linking the islands of Southeast Asia, vast exposed continental shelves that humans and animals cross with no awareness, that beneath their feet lies what will one day be ocean floor. The landscape is a mosaic of extremes. In Europe, much of the land is steppe tundra, a cold, dry grassland dotted with hardy shrubs and scattered stands of pine and birch near river valleys. It's not barren, but it's severe. The ground is permafrost in many places, frozen solid beneath a thin layer of soil that thaws only in the brief summer. Winds sweep across these grasslands with nothing to stop them, carrying dust and cold and the scent of distance. Further south, forests persist. Oak, hazel, elm. But even these are fragmented, sensitive to the slightest climate shifts. A few degrees cooler, and the forests retreat. A few degrees warmer, and they expand again. The boundary between forest and steppe moves like a tide across the landscape, and the people who live there must move with it. In Africa, the climate is also changing, though in different rhythms. The Sahara expands and contracts with the planet's orbital cycles. Sometimes it's desert, impenetrable and empty. Other times, during what scientists call green Sahara periods, it blooms with grasslands, lakes, rivers and life. 100,000 years ago it's transitioning. Some regions are still habitable. Others are closing off, forcing populations to migrate toward the coasts, toward the Rift Valley, toward places where water and game still exist. Asia is equally diverse. The Tibetan plateau is harsh and high, yet people are there, adapting to thin air and extreme cold. In the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean region, the climate is relatively mild, a corridor between continents where different groups meet, mingle, and sometimes compete. Southeast Asia, with its lower sea levels, is a network of interconnected landmasses covered in tropical forests and savannas, a world dense with life, but also with dangers. And in all these places, amid all this diversity, one truth holds constant. The climate is not stable. The Pleistocene doesn't simply sit in one cold state and stay there. It oscillates, violently. Over the span of a human lifetime, 70, maybe 80 years if you're lucky, you might experience several dramatic climate swings. A decade of brutal cold might give way suddenly to a period of warming, melting ice, flooding rivers. Then, just as suddenly, the cold returns. The growing season shortens. The herds move. The plants you relied on disappear. This volatility shapes everything. It shapes migration patterns. People follow the herds, follow the rain, follow the coastlines as they shift. It shapes survival strategies. You can't rely on one food source, one location, one season. Adaptability becomes the key to existence. Flexibility. The ability to read the environment, to predict where the herds will go, to know when to move and when to hunker down. And it shapes the mind. Because living in a world that constantly changes demands a certain kind of intelligence, memory, planning, cooperation, the ability to pass down knowledge about places you visited years ago, about animals you hunted, about plants that can sustain you when everything else fails. But let's zoom out for a moment and consider what it actually feels like to inhabit this world. Imagine the cold. Not the cold of a winter morning where you dash from your car to your front door. Not the cold of a ski resort where you know a warm lodge awaits. This is cold that penetrates everything. Cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. Cold that turns your fingers numb in minutes, that makes your face ache, that can kill you if you're not careful. In the depths of winter, temperatures plunge far below freezing. In some regions, they stay there for months. The wind, always the wind, cuts through any covering, finds any gap in your shelter, any weakness in your clothing. Frostbite is a constant threat. Hypothermia is a shadow that follows you. Children and elders are especially vulnerable. Injuries that compromise mobility can become death sentences because you can't stay warm if you can't move. And then there's the darkness. At northern latitudes, winter means long nights, sometimes 20 hours of darkness or more. The sun, when it appears at all, barely crests the horizon before sinking again. The world becomes a place of twilight and shadow. Without modern lighting, without electricity, this darkness is absolute. The night is not just an absence of light. It's a presence, a weight, a thing that swallows. Fire becomes everything. We'll talk more about fire's role in technology and culture, but here, in the context of the environment, fire is the centre around which all survival revolves. Fire is warmth that keeps you alive through the night. Fire is light that pushes back the darkness and the predators that move within it. Fire is protection, a circle of flame that cave bears and hyenas respect, that saber-toothed cats think twice about crossing. fire is also transformation. Raw meat, hard to digest and full of parasites, becomes safe, nutritious, easier to chew. Tough roots and tubers, inedible when raw, become soft and caloric. Fire extends the range of what humans can eat, which in turn extends the range of where they can live. And fire is community, because at night, when the cold presses in and the darkness is total, everyone gathers around the flames. Elders tell stories, children listen, tools are made, hides are worked, plans are discussed. The fire is the hearth, the centre, the place where the group becomes more than just individuals trying to survive. It becomes a we. But fire is also fragile. Keeping it alive in wet conditions, in high winds, in the relentless cold of a glacial winter, this requires skill, vigilance, constant attention. Losing your fire can mean death, so fire is tended constantly, carried carefully when the group moves, protected like the precious, almost magical resource it is. Now, let's talk about shelter. Because you can't survive the Ice Age by sleeping in the open. In some places, natural caves provide refuge. Rock overhangs, deep caverns where the walls block the wind and the temperature stays relatively stable. These become homes, sometimes for generations. Archaeologists have found sites where the same caves were inhabited repeatedly over thousands of years. Different groups, different eras, but the same logic. This place offers safety. But caves are not always available, and not all caves are safe. Some are already occupied by animals who won't give them up willingly. So humans build. They construct shelters from whatever materials the land provides. In the mammoth steppe, where trees are scarce, they use the bones and tusks of the very animals they hunt. Mammoth ribs become the framework for tents. Hides stretched over these bones create walls. Rocks and packed earth anchor the structure against the wind. Inside, layers of fur and grass provide insulation. It's not comfortable by modern standards, but it works. It keeps you alive. In forested regions, branches and saplings are bent into domes and covered with bark, leaves, moss, more hides. Windbreaks, simple walls of stacked brush or stone, provide protection from the relentless gales. These structures are often temporary, built for a season or a few weeks, then abandoned when the group moves on. And movement is constant, because survival in the Paleolithic is about following resources. Water is the first priority. Rivers, streams, springs, lakes, these anchor settlement patterns. In winter, when water freezes, people must know where to find sources that remain accessible, where ice can be melted, where groundwater seeps to the surface. Food is the second priority, and food moves. The great herds of the Ice Age, reindeer, bison, wild horses, aurochs, migrate with the seasons. They follow the grass, the melting snow, the ancient paths their kind have walked for millennia, and humans follow them. This creates a yearly rhythm. Summer might mean moving to higher elevations where the herds go to escape insects and find fresh grazing. Autumn means following them back down, positioning yourself along their migration routes, preparing for the hunt that will sustain you through winter. Winter itself often means staying put, sheltering in place, living off stored food and whatever small game can be found nearby. Spring means dispersal again, spreading out to gather the first plants, to hunt the young animals, to replenish what winter consumed. It's a hard life. It's also a life in motion, a life connected intimately to the rhythms of the planet. And then there's the megafauna. Because if you thought the landscape was impressive, wait until you meet the neighbours. 100,000 years ago, Earth is home to animals that would make a modern safari look tame. Mammoths, woolly mammoths in the northern regions, steppe mammoths, southern mammoths, massive creatures standing 4 meters at the shoulder, covered in shaggy brown fur, tusks curving in elegant, deadly arcs. They move in herds across the grasslands, ancient and patient, grazing on tough steppe grasses and low shrubs. They're dangerous if provoked, but mostly their resources. A single mammoth provides thousands of kilograms of meat, enough to feed a group for weeks. The bones become tools, shelter, fuel. The hide becomes clothing. The fat becomes lamp oil. Nothing is wasted. Woolly rhinoceroses, stocky, aggressive, less predictable than mammoths. 2 horns on their snouts, thick fur, and a temperament that makes them best avoided unless you have no other choice. Cave bears, enormous, twice the size of modern bears, living in the same caves humans want to occupy. Most of the time they're peaceful, feeding on plants and roots. But in close quarters, or if you stumble into a den with cubs, they become a nightmare. And then there are the predators. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive today, hunting in prides across the steppe. Cave hyenas, pack hunters with bone-crushing jaws, scavengers and killers both. Saber-toothed cats in some regions, though their time is fading. Dholes, wild dogs that hunt in coordinated groups. Wolves, cunning and relentless. For early humans, the megafauna are a double-edged sword. They're food, they're clothing, they're tools, but they're also competition, danger, death. Every hunt is a negotiation with a risk. Every moment outside the safety of the fire is a moment in a world where you are not the apex predator. You're merely one competitor among many. In other regions, different giants roam. In the Americas, though human presence there is still debated for this time period, giant ground sloths lumber through forests, massive and strange. In Australia, marsupial megafauna dominate, though they too are beginning their long decline. In Southeast Asia, orangutans and tigers share the forest with early human groups. The world is full, it teems with life, and that life is not small, not timid, not easy to ignore. Living in this world requires constant vigilance. You learn to read tracks in the mud, to identify the gait of a mammoth versus a rhino, to know the difference between the scat of a herbivore and a carnivore. You learn the sounds, the distant trumpet of a mammoth, the howl of wolves at dusk, the rustling that means something large is moving through the brush nearby. You learn to be quiet, to move carefully, to understand that arrogance, carelessness, a moment's inattention, any of these can be fatal. And yet, amid all this harshness, there is beauty. Because the Ice Age, for all its brutality, is also a world of profound, aching beauty. The auroras, the northern lights, dance across the sky in winter, green and violet and shimmering white, ribbons of light that ancient peoples must have watched in wonder and terror, trying to understand what spirits moved in the heavens, the stars. Without light pollution, without cities, the night sky is a tapestry of brilliance. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge, but a river of light arcing overhead. Constellations are guides, markers, stories written in fire, the silence of snow. A fresh snowfall dampens all sound, creates a hush so complete it feels sacred. The world becomes white and still, and for a moment the harshness softens. The storms, lightning over the steppe, great rolling thunderheads that stretch to the horizon, wind that roars like a living thing. There's terror in these storms, yes, but also awe. The raw power of the planet made visible. Sunrises and sunsets that paint the sky in colours we still see today. Proof that beauty at least is constant across the millennia. And there's beauty in the land itself. The sweep of grassland stretching to infinity. The dense mystery of forests. The stark elegance of glaciers. Blue ice towering above everything. ancient and implacable. The way light moves across the landscape at different times of day, different seasons. The way rivers carve through rock, patient and relentless. The people who live in this world are shaped by it in ways both practical and profound. They develop a relationship with the land that's difficult for us to fully comprehend. It's not romantic in the modern sense. There's no leisure time to contemplate nature for its own sake. Survival is too immediate, too demanding. But there's a deep, lived knowledge, an intimacy born from necessity. They know which plants are edible and which are poisonous. They know when the salmon run, when the birds migrate, when the reindeer will pass through the valley. They know the moods of the sky, what kind of clouds mean snow, which winds bring rain, how the behaviour of animals changes before a storm. This knowledge is survival, but it's also connection. These people are part of the landscape, not separate from it. They don't control their environment, they negotiate with it. They adapt to its rhythms, they respect its power. And emotionally, living in such a world creates particular psychology. There's fear, certainly. Fear of the cold, of the dark, of the predators, of injury, of starvation. Fear is a constant companion, a voice that says, be careful, pay attention, don't take unnecessary risks. But there's also courage, because despite the fear, people venture out into the cold to hunt. They cross frozen rivers, they stand their ground against dangerous animals, they give birth in conditions that would horrify us. They care for their injured and their elderly even when resources are scarce. There's awe. How could there not be? Living under those skies, witnessing the raw power of storms and glaciers and the great herds moving like rivers across the plains, this inspires something. A sense of the numinous, the recognition that you're part of something vast, something ancient, something beyond full comprehension. And there's resilience, because to live in the Ice Age you can't break, you endure. You wake up cold and hungry and you keep going. You face loss, children who don't survive, elders who fall behind, hunts that fail, and you grieve, and then you continue. Because the alternative is death. This resilience isn't just physical, it's cultural. Groups develop stories, songs, rituals, ways of making meaning from the hardship, of binding people together, of creating continuity across generations. We'll explore this more deeply later, but even here, in the context of environment, it's worth noting the harshness of the world shapes not just bodies, but minds and cultures. The Ice Age environment is a crucible. It tests every aspect of human existence. It rewards adaptability, intelligence, cooperation. It punishes rigidity, isolation, carelessness. Those who survive are the ones who can read the land, who can work together, who can innovate when the old ways stop working. And 100,000 years ago, multiple human species are facing these same tests across different landscapes. Neanderthals in Europe are adapting to the cold steppes and forests. Denisovans in Asia are mastering high-altitude survival. Homo sapiens in Africa are navigating shifting climates and expanding populations. Each is finding their own answers. Each is carving out their own existence in this world of ice, fire, and stone. But here's the fascinating part. The environment doesn't just select for survival. It creates opportunities. Those land bridges that emerge from falling sea levels, they become highways for migration, for expansion into new territories. The climate instability that makes life difficult, it also makes adaptation essential, which accelerates innovation. The presence of megafauna, it requires sophisticated hunting strategies, which in turn requires communication, planning, technology. In other words, the very harshness of the Ice Age world is part of what drives human evolution forward. It's the forge in which our species is shaped. So when you imagine life 100,000 years ago, don't imagine simple primitives huddling in caves, barely scraping by. Imagine intelligent, adaptable, resilient people navigating a world that demands everything they have. Imagine groups with deep knowledge of their environment, with strategies honed over generations, with tools and techniques we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. Imagine waking in the cold darkness, emerging into a landscape of brutal beauty, and having the skill, the knowledge, the courage to face it. That's the world they inhabited. A world where ice sheets carved continents, where mammoths walked in herds beneath aurora-filled skies, where fire was the difference between life and death, and shelter was something you built with your own hands from bones and hides and stone. A world that would kill you without hesitation if you made a mistake, and a world that, for those who knew its secrets, could sustain life for 70,000 generations. But survival was only part of the equation, because humans don't just survive, they think, they create, they innovate. And that brings us to the next chapter of this story. The tools they made, the technologies they developed, and the revolution happening inside their minds. Picture this. A napper sits cross-legged on a patch of exposed stone, the afternoon sun warming the ground. In one hand a hammerstone, smooth, heavy, the size of a fist. In the other a core of flint, dark and glassy, fresh from the riverbed. The napper lifts the hammerstone, brings it down. A sharp crack echoes across the landscape. Nothing happens. Again. Another strike. The angle slightly different this time. A thin flake peels away, landing in the dust. One strike. One flake. To make a single hand axe, that elegant teardrop-shaped icon of the Paleolithic, requires somewhere between 200 and 500 strikes. Each one must land at the correct angle, with the correct force, on the correct point of impact. Too hard, and the core shatters. Too soft, and nothing breaks away. Too steep an angle, and the fracture runs wrong, ruining the piece. This isn't luck. This is knowledge. Stone tool technology represents one of humanity's oldest and most enduring innovations. For over 2 million years, stone was the Swiss Army knife of existence. Weapon, cutter, scraper, knife, saw. But here, 100,000 years ago, we're witnessing something far beyond crude rocks bashed together. We're looking at precision engineering. We're looking at mastery, and the mind required to create it. That's where it gets truly fascinating. Let's talk about what it actually takes to make a stone tool. First, you need to understand lithic mechanics, the way stone fractures. Flint, chert, obsidian, quartzite. Each has its own personality, its own grain, its own temperament. You need to know where to find it, how to test its quality, how to recognize inclusions or flaws that will doom your work before it begins. Then comes spatial reasoning. You must envision the tool hidden inside the raw stone. Like a sculptor seeing the statue within the marble, the napper sees the hand axe within the nodule. Every strike removes material that can never be replaced. There is no undo button in lithic technology. You must plan 20 strikes ahead, visualizing the three-dimensional geometry of fracture propagation. Planning, foresight, mental rotation of complex shapes. These are executive functions, higher cognition, the kind of thinking we associate with architects and engineers. But it doesn't stop there. This knowledge must be taught. A stone tool tradition doesn't emerge from instinct. It requires demonstration, correction, practice, and patience. Years of practice. Archaeological sites reveal learning areas where novice nappers produced hundreds of failed attempts, their mistakes preserved in stone. Master nappers sat beside apprentices, showing the grip, the angle, the rhythm. Language may have helped, but much of this teaching happened through observation and imitation, what we call pedagogy, structured learning, the transmission of culture across generations. 100,000 years ago, someone who could nap well was invaluable. This skill meant the difference between eating and starving, between defending and dying, between thriving and merely surviving. And the tools themselves? They were extraordinary. The hand axe is perhaps the most iconic, elegant, symmetrical, refined over 1,000,000 years of iteration. But by 100,000 years ago, the toolkit had exploded into specialization. There were scrapers for working hide, their edges meticulously retouched for durability. Burins, with their chisel-like points for engraving bone and antler. Backed knives, with one edge deliberately blunted so you could grip it without cutting yourself. Projectile points, some small enough to tip a spear, others designed as darts for atlatl. Spear throwers that multiplied throwing force and range. Each tool served a specific purpose, each required different techniques to produce. The Levallois technique, named after a suburb of Paris where it was first identified, represents a quantum leap in cognitive sophistication. Instead of striking flakes randomly from a core, the napper would prepare the entire surface of the stone first, shaping it into a kind of platform. Then, with one or two carefully placed strikes, they would remove a predetermined flake of exactly the right size and shape. It's like preloading the stone with your desired outcome. Planning several steps ahead. Delayed gratification in mineral form. Think about that for a moment. The napper invests significant time and effort preparing something they will ultimately destroy in order to create the thing they actually want. That's abstract thinking. That's the ability to hold multiple nested goals in mind simultaneously. That's human. But stone wasn't the only material they mastered. Bone and antler opened entirely new possibilities. These organic materials are more forgiving than stone, easier to shape, less brittle, capable of being ground and polished rather than fractured. And by 100,000 years ago, people were creating sophisticated bone technology, needles, actual eyed needles, thin as wire, polished smooth, with holes bored through one end for threading sinew. Archaeological examples are so refined they could be mistaken for modern needles until you carbon date them. These tools enabled the sewing of tailored clothing, waterproof seams, insulated garments that meant the difference between life and death in glacial climates. Harpoons with backward-facing barbs that would lodge in prey, preventing escape. Fishing gorges, double-pointed bone pieces that would turn sideways in a fish's throat when the line was pulled. Awls for punching holes in leather, burnishers for smoothing and waterproofing hides. Each one represents not just technical skill, but specialized knowledge. How to select the right bone, how to soak it to prevent cracking, how to groove it, snap it, grind it into shape, how to polish it with sand and hide until it gleamed. And all of this required patience, hours and hours of repetitive work, the ability to delay gratification, to invest today for a tool that will pay dividends tomorrow. That's not something every species can do. That requires impulse control, future planning, and belief that tomorrow will come. Perhaps even more impressive than the tools themselves was the technology of combining materials. Hafting, the binding of stone points to wooden shafts, sounds simple until you try to do it. How do you attach a stone blade to a wooden handle so securely that it won't break, slip, or fly off when you're using it to butcher a bison or thrust it into a predator? The answer is composite technology. First, you carve a groove or socket in the wood. You shape the stone to fit. Then you secure it with adhesive, birch bark pitch, heated and worked until it becomes sticky and strong. You wrap it with sinew from animal tendons which shrinks as it dries, gripping like a vice. You might add rawhide strips for extra security, crisscrossing them in patterns that distribute stress. The result? A tool that's greater than the sum of its parts. A tool that combines the cutting edge of stone with the leverage and reach of wood, bound together with materials harvested and processed from the landscape. This is engineering. This is chemistry. This is material science practiced by people without laboratories or textbooks or written language. And it gets better. Different regions developed different hafting traditions, different adhesives, different binding patterns. You can look at how a spear point was hafted and know not just when it was made, but where and by which cultural group. The technology carries signatures of identity. Technology as culture. Technology as expression. Now, let's talk about fire. By 100,000 years ago, the ability to create fire was widespread. But that doesn't mean it was easy. Making fire is one of the most cognitively demanding tasks in the Paleolithic survival handbook. There are two main methods, friction and percussion. Friction fire, the hand drill or bow drill, requires exactly the right combination of wood species. A hardwood spindle rotating against a softwood base. Dry, not brittle. Seasoned, not fresh. The technique requires precise pressure, steady speed, and the ability to maintain it until you create an ember in the resulting sawdust. If you've ever tried this yourself, you know. It's exhausting. It takes practice, and humidity, wind, or the wrong materials will defeat you every time. Percussion fire, striking flint against iron pyrite or marcasite, produces sparks that must land in prepared tinder. That tinder must be the right material. Charred cloth, thistledown, dried grass, crumbled fungus. It must be completely dry. It must catch the spark, nurture it, blow into a coal, then coax it into flame with increasingly larger fuel. This entire process requires a deep understanding of combustion, material science, and sequential planning. You can't just decide to make fire. You must prepare. You must gather tinder, kindling, and fuel, different sizes, different rates of burn. You must know which woods produce long-lasting coals versus quick heat, which create smoke for signalling or smoking meat, which burn clean for cooking, and this knowledge had to be passed down. A person who couldn't make fire was utterly dependent on others or on captured fire, constantly maintained, never allowed to die. Communities likely had designated firekeepers, specialists who understood the temperament of flame, who could nurse a coal through a rainstorm or bring fire back from the edge of extinction. Fire was technology, but it was also sacred. It was transformation itself, cold to warm, raw to cooked, dark to light, danger to safety. The hearth was the heart of the community, and the ability to summon it from nothing. That was power. That was knowledge. That was the mind's fire made manifest. With fire came clothing technology. Animal hides, when properly processed, become leather, supple, durable, protective. But raw hide is stiff, prone to rot, and practically useless. Transforming it requires knowledge. First, the hide must be scraped clean of fat and tissue using stone scrapers, careful work that removes material without puncturing the skin. Then comes the crucial step, tanning. This might involve rubbing the hide with the animal brains, which contain tannins, working it repeatedly to break down fibres, smoking it over fire to prevent decay and repel insects, and stretching it as it dries. The result is leather soft enough to wrap around a body, tough enough to stop thorns and wind, warm enough to insulate against killing cold. And they didn't stop at simple wraps. Evidence suggests tailored sewn clothing, garments with seams, sleeves, fitted shapes. Those bone needles we mentioned earlier, they enabled stitching sinew through prepared hides, creating weatherproof seams, reinforced stress points, and fitted silhouettes that trapped warm air close to the skin. This is fashion as survival technology, clothing that allowed human expansion into climates where naked apes had no business surviving. Some garments may have been decorated, dyed with ochre, adorned with shells or teeth, marked with patterns that indicated identity or status. We'll explore that more in the next section. But even purely functional clothing represents staggering knowledge. Which animal skins work best for which purposes, how to prepare them, how to cut and sew them, how to repair and maintain them, and possibly, there were woven plant fibres, cordage made from bark or grass twisted into rope, baskets woven from reeds, nets knotted for fishing or carrying. These materials rarely survive in the archaeological record, but indirect evidence and ethnographic parallels suggest they were likely present. Fibre technology is ancient, widespread, and incredibly useful. Clothing and textiles aren't just protection, they're identity, they're culture made visible, they're the boundary between self and world, shaped by human hands according to human needs and human imagination. Now let's turn to how they actually acquired food. Hunting technology and strategy represent some of the most sophisticated achievements of Paleolithic people. First, understand. Humans are not particularly impressive predators on paper. We're not fast. We lack claws, fangs, venom. We can't fly or burrow or camouflage ourselves, but we have something better. We have endurance. We have planning. We have cooperation. Endurance hunting, also called persistence hunting, exploits our unique ability to run long distances while regulating body temperature through sweating. Many animals can sprint faster than us, but few can run for hours. A human hunter can track an antelope, push it into repeated flight, never letting it rest until it collapses from heat exhaustion. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and it works. But there are other strategies. Cooperative ambush hunting uses the landscape itself as a weapon. Funnel animals toward a cliff or dead-end canyon. Position hunters along the escape routes. Drive prey toward the trap. This requires coordination, communication, and intimate knowledge of animal behaviour. How they move when panicked, where they'll try to flee, what will make them bolt or freeze. Tracking is its own science. The ability to read a landscape for signs of passage, disturbed earth, bent grass, broken branches, scent, scat, feeding signs. Skilled trackers can determine not just what animal passed, but when, how fast it was moving, whether it was injured, whether others were with it. They can extrapolate from fragments to construct a narrative, a story written in the ground. Then there's the technology of the hunt itself. Spears with stone or bone points, designed to penetrate hide and cause catastrophic bleeding. Atlatls, spear throwers that use leverage to multiply throwing force and distance. Throwing sticks for stunning or killing smaller game. Weighted bolas that tangle legs and bring down running prey. Traps and snares made from cordage and bent branches, set along game trails and checked regularly. Each hunting method requires different tools, different knowledge, different group sizes and roles, and the choice of method depends on the prey, the terrain, the season, the number of hunters available. This is adaptive technology, flexible problem solving in real time. But the hunt is only the beginning. Once you've brought down a large animal, the real work starts. Butchery is technical knowledge made visceral. Where to make the first cut, how to peel back the hide without puncturing the intestines, which organs to remove first, how to separate muscle groups along fascial planes, where to strike bone to access marrow, the calorie-dense, fat-rich treasure inside. Stone tools made this possible, but knowledge made it efficient. An experienced butcher can process a carcass in a fraction of the time it takes a novice, wasting nothing, preserving everything. And preservation was crucial. A large kill represents more meat than a group can consume immediately. Without refrigeration, you have to be creative. Thin strips of meat dried in the sun or smoke become jerky, lightweight, shelf-stable, portable. Fat rendered and stored in skin pouches provides concentrated energy. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat and berries, becomes the ultimate survival food, lasting months. Smoking meat over low, smoky fires not only dries it, but impregnates it with compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. It's food preservation and flavouring in one, and the knowledge of which woods produce the best smoke, how to build a smoking rack, how to maintain the right temperature. All of this is technical expertise accumulated over generations. Cooking itself is transformative. Fire breaks down tough fibres, denatures proteins, kills parasites, and unlocks nutrients that would otherwise pass through us undigested. Cooked food provides more calories for less effort, energy that fuels larger brains. There's a theory that cooking quite literally made us human. That mastery of fire and the shift to cooked food allowed our ancestors to invest less energy in digestion and more in cognition. Whether or not that's the full story, it's undeniable. By 100,000 years ago, cooking was central to human life. And it's worth pausing here to appreciate the chemical knowledge embedded in that practice. Which plants are poisonous raw but safe when cooked. Which parts of animals are nutritious versus dangerous. How to extract marrow, how to soften hide, how to prepare sinew for cord. This is applied biology, learnt through observation, experimentation, and occasionally tragedy. Every edible plant, every cooking technique, every preservation method represents knowledge purchased at the cost of trial and error. Someone, sometime, ate the wrong route and died. Someone else watched, learned, and remembered. Knowledge written in survival itself. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Not all human species developed the same technology. Neanderthals, those close cousins who inhabited Europe and Western Asia, developed the Mustian tool tradition. These were sophisticated tools, make no mistake. Flake-based technology with careful retouching, scrapers and points of high quality. They used hafted spears for hunting, controlled fire with expertise, and produced hide-working tools that imply tailored clothing. But Homo sapiens developed something slightly different. Blade technology. Blades are elongated flakes, at least twice as long as they are wide, struck from specially prepared cores. This technique produces more cutting edge per pound of stone, more efficiency, more tools from less material. It's economical, it's elegant, and it proliferates rapidly across sapiens sites. Why the difference? That's still debated. It might reflect different raw material availability, different prey, different cultural traditions, or perhaps subtle cognitive differences, though we should be very careful about assuming Neanderthals were less intelligent. They survived in some of the harshest climates on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. That's not the resume of failures. Regional variations flourished. In Africa, the Still Bay and Howisson's Port traditions produced incredibly refined points, some of them heat-treated to improve flaking quality. In Europe, different Mousterian subtypes emerged based on tool composition and technique. In Asia, yet other traditions developed, adapted to local resources and needs. Technology was never universal. It was local, adapted, innovative in different directions. This diversity is crucial. It shows that toolmaking wasn't just about solving problems, it was about cultural identity, about traditions passed down parent to child, about regional knowledge adapted to regional challenges, technology as culture, technology as heritage. So what does all of this mean? Tools aren't just objects. their thoughts made solid. Every hand axe is a three-dimensional representation of an idea, a concept held in the mind, translated through skill into physical form. Every hafted spear is a synthesis of materials and methods, a problem solved through ingenuity. Every fired ceramic, every sewn garment, every carved bone, every processed hide, each one represents knowledge, creativity, and patience. Technology is the material evidence of human genius. It's how we extended our bodies beyond their biological limits. Stone became our claws, fire became our digestive system, clothing became our fur, spears became our fangs. But more than that, technology became our memory. Unlike genetic evolution, which takes millennia, technological evolution happens in human time. A good idea can spread within a generation. An innovation can change survival odds immediately, and, because tools can be studied, copied and improved, knowledge accumulates. It builds, it compounds. This is cumulative culture, the ratchet effect that allows each generation to stand on the shoulders of the last, rather than starting from scratch. And it's not just practical. We'll see this even more clearly in the next section, but technology and art are intertwined. The same hands that carved spear points also carved figurines. The same minds that planned hunts also planned rituals. The line between tool and symbol, between function and meaning, is thinner than we often imagine. 100,000 years ago, humans held fire in their hands. They shaped stone to their will. They wrapped themselves in the skins of other animals and walked into climates that should have killed them. They were tool makers. They were problem solvers. They were engineers and chemists and teachers. And every tool they made carried a signature, not just of function, but of thought, of culture, of the mind's fire burning bright against the dark. But tools alone don't make us fully human. There's something else. Something harder to quantify, harder to find in the archaeological record, but undeniably present. Art, ritual, meaning. Let's go there next. Imagine holding a piece of red ochre in your hand, not as paint, not as decoration, but as something more, something that exists purely because you chose to make it exist. A mark on a cave wall that serves no purpose for hunting. A bead carved from shell that fills no stomach. A song hummed into the darkness that doesn't summon prey or warn of danger. This is the moment when survival stopped being enough. When our ancestors, not just Homo sapiens but others who walked alongside us, began to create meaning where none existed before. When they looked at the world and said, in whatever language they possessed, this matters. Not because it keeps me alive, but because it makes me feel. Welcome to the birth of culture, the emergence of art, the point in our story where humanity became more than clever primates with sharp tools. This is where we became ease. Let's start with colour. Around 100,000 years ago, across multiple continents, something remarkable begins appearing in the archaeological record. Chunks of ochre, iron oxide that ranges from yellow to deep red, showing clear signs of use, ground down, scraped, mixed with other substances, sometimes carved with patterns. These aren't accidental discoveries, these are intentional collections. People were travelling to specific locations to gather this material. They were processing it deliberately. And here's the question that should stop us in our tracks. Why? Ochre doesn't make tools sharper. It doesn't make meat taste better. You can't eat it. You can't hunt with it. And it won't keep you warm at night. By every practical measure, it's useless. And yet they wanted it. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found ochre pieces dating back 100,000 years, some engraved with geometric patterns, crosshatches, deliberate designs that required planning, steady hands, and most importantly, the abstract thought to envision something that didn't yet exist. This is symbolic thinking. the ability to let something represent something else, to create meaning beyond the immediate and tangible. This is the cognitive foundation for everything that follows: language, art, religion, mathematics. Every abstract concept humans have ever conceived traces its ancestry back to minds that could look at a piece of coloured rock and see more than just a rock. And it wasn't just us. The more we dig, the more we discover that Neanderthals possessed their own rich cultural life. A life we're only now beginning to appreciate after decades of underestimating them. In a cave in Croatia, archaeologists found something extraordinary: a collection of eagle talons dated to 130,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. These talons had been modified, cut marks showing they'd been removed from the birds deliberately, polished smooth from handling, arranged as if they'd once been strung together. Jewellery, personal adornment, a Neanderthal wearing eagle claws around their neck or wrist, not for protection or practical purpose, but because it meant something to them. Eagles are not easy prey. They're apex predators, dangerous and rare. To wear their talons suggests status, accomplishment, perhaps even spiritual significance. It suggests a mind that understood symbolism, that created social meaning through objects. In other Neanderthal sites, we find more evidence of aesthetic sensibility. Pigments, red and black, the colours that will dominate human art for millennia. Shells transported from distant coastlines, pierced for stringing. At Bruniquel Cave in France, Neanderthals ventured deep underground, far beyond where natural light could reach, to construct mysterious circular structures from broken stalagmites. Why? We don't know, but pragmatic survival doesn't lead you half a kilometre into a cave's darkness to arrange stones in patterns. That's ritual, that's meaning-making. And then there's the art. For years we thought cave art was exclusively a Homo sapiens innovation. The paintings of Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, those magnificent galleries were our defining achievement, proof of our unique creative genius. But dating techniques have forced us to reconsider. Some cave art in Spain, handprints, geometric shapes, red discs, dates to more than 65,000 years ago. That's at least 20,000 years before Homo sapiens reached that part of Europe, which means Neanderthals made them. They stood in firelight, placed their hand against cold stone, and blew pigment around it. They left their mark. They said, "I was here. I existed. Remember me." If that doesn't move you, I don't know what will, but art takes many forms, and some of the most profound expressions leave almost no archaeological trace. Imagine the process. A Homo sapiens woman in southern Africa gathers ochre from a riverbed deposit. She selects specific pieces, not just any red stone, but ones with the right consistency, the richest colour. She grinds the ochre against a flat rock, creating a fine powder. Then comes the crucial step. She mixes it with bone marrow fat, perhaps adding a binding agent, creating a paste that can be applied to skin. Why go through this elaborate process? Because appearance mattered. Identity mattered. Body decoration is ephemeral. It doesn't fossilise, doesn't preserve. But we know it happened. We find the grinding stones, the shells used as containers, the evidence of complex ochre processing. At Sibudu Cave in South Africa, archaeologists discovered an ochre processing toolkit 50,000 years old, complete with everything needed to create body paint. Think about what this means. These weren't isolated incidents of artistic expression. This was systematic, repeatable, passed down through generations. Someone taught someone else how to do this. Knowledge flowed from elder to youth, from experienced to novice. This is cultural transmission. the foundation of human civilization. And it wasn't just paint. Shell beads appear in the record stretching back 100,000 years, each one painstakingly perforated, often using stone tools that would take considerable time and skill to create that small, precise hole. A single bead might take an hour to make. A necklace of 20 beads represents 20 hours of focused labour that produced nothing you could eat or throw at prey, but labour that created something beautiful, something that distinguished you from others, or united you with your group, something that said, "This is who I am. This is who we are." And then there are the burials. Perhaps nothing speaks more eloquently about the inner lives of these ancient people than how they treated their dead. The Neanderthal burial at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France tells a striking story. The body was placed in a shallow grave, deliberately positioned, with stone tools nearby. The skeleton of a cave bear jaw was placed with them. This wasn't a body abandoned where it fell. This was intentional, careful. This was ceremony. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found Neanderthal burials that sparked decades of debate. Some showed evidence of being laid to rest with flowers, pollen clustered around the remains in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. While this specific interpretation remains contested, the burials themselves are undeniable. Bodies positioned deliberately, protected from scavengers, returned to the earth with care. Why bury the dead at all? Practical answers don't quite work. Yes, a body left in a living space attracts predators and disease, but you could just leave the cave, move to another shelter. You don't need to dig into hard ground, to spend hours of precious energy creating a grave, unless you cared, unless you grieved, unless some part of you believed this person deserved respect even in death. Homo sapiens buried their dead too, often with even more elaborate care. At Kafze Cave in Israel, bodies 100,000 years old were buried with red ochre and shell beads. A child was laid to rest with deer antlers placed deliberately at their chest. This is more than hygiene. This is ritual. This suggests belief, perhaps belief in an afterlife, in continued existence beyond death. At minimum, it demonstrates that death had meaning beyond the biological cessation of function. The people mourned, they remembered, they created ceremonies to mark the loss, to process grief collectively, to honour the departed. They loved. But let's not think of these lives as solemn and silent. Culture isn't just art and ritual, it's also joy, connection, play. Consider music. The oldest known musical instruments are bone flutes, carved from vulture wing bones and mammoth ivory. The most ancient dates to about 40,000 years ago, but the sophistication suggests a long developmental history we simply haven't found yet. Creating a flute requires extraordinary skill. You must select the right bone, hollow, straight, strong enough to carve without shattering. You must know where to place the finger holes to produce specific pitches. You must understand that spacing matters, that airflow matters, that the instrument is creating sound through principles of physics your culture might not consciously understand, but has learned through experimentation. This isn't accidental. This is engineering in service of art. And once you have a flute, you have music. Notes that flow into melodies. Sounds that can soothe or excite, that can accompany dance or punctuate storytelling. Music that creates shared emotional experiences, that bonds groups together in the act of creation and listening. But instruments are just one dimension. The human voice itself is an instrument, and it requires no crafting, no tools, no materials beyond what we were born with. Rhythm and percussion need nothing but hands and surfaces to strike, clapping, drumming on hollow logs, stamping feet against earth. Every human culture ever documented has made music. It's as universal as language, as fundamental to our nature as tool-making. And 100,000 years ago, they were human. They had the same vocal anatomy, the same hands, the same neurological capacity for rhythm and pattern recognition. They sang. They must have. Imagine it. Evening, around a fire, the day's work done, bellies full or empty, it hardly matters. Someone begins a rhythm, others join. A melody emerges, wordless or full of words we'll never understand. Children watch wide-eyed, learning. Elders sway, remembering. This is culture in motion. This is humanity expressing itself beyond survival. And where there's music, there's story. Before writing, which wouldn't be invented for another 95,000 years, every piece of knowledge humans possessed lived in memory and voice. Every technique for crafting tools, every migration route, every medicinal plant, every lesson learned from watching animal behaviour, all of it transmitted orally, from person to person, generation to generation. But not just practical knowledge, also identity, history, meaning. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why does the sun rise? Where do we go when we die? These questions don't have practical answers, but humans ask them anyway. We can't help it. And in answering them, we create stories. Myths that explain the inexplicable, that give structure to chaos, that bind communities together through shared belief. We can't know what specific stories people told 100,000 years ago. Those words are lost to time, dissolved into air the moment they were spoken. But we know they told them, because storytelling isn't cultural, it's human, it's cognitive. Our brains are wired for narrative, for understanding the world through cause and effect, character and conflict, beginning and ending. And storytelling serves profound social functions. It educates the young without risking their lives to direct experience. It preserves the wisdom of the old beyond their individual mortality. It creates shared knowledge that allows cooperation at scale. Around those ancient fires, in those shelters and caves, stories were being told. Tales of hunts and migrations, stories about ancestors, about animals, about the land itself. Perhaps stories that explained why ochre was sacred, why certain places should be honoured, why the dead deserved burial. Every story told was an act of culture. Every listener who carried that story forward was participating in the creation of collective identity. This is how humans became more than individuals. We became peoples, tribes, cultures with continuity across time. But culture isn't abstract ritual or artistic expression alone. It's also the daily acts of connection that bind individuals into communities. The sharing of food goes far beyond nutrition. When you give someone meat you hunted, you're creating obligation, relationship, alliance. You're saying, your survival matters to me. You're weaving the social fabric that allows groups to function as units rather than collections of competing individuals. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record in unexpected ways. Butchery sites with too much meat for one family. Sharing wasn't optional, it was necessary. Without refrigeration, large game spoils quickly. Better to distribute it widely, to create debts and goodwill that will be repaid when someone else makes a kill. But necessity evolves into culture. The practical act of sharing becomes a value, a social norm, eventually perhaps a spiritual principle. Generosity becomes virtue, and there are other forms of bonding. Grooming, picking through hair, removing parasites, tending to each other's bodies, is a primate inheritance we still practice. In modified forms, it's intimate, calming. It builds trust through gentle, repeated physical contact. We find ancient art showing people together, touching, connected. We find living spaces arranged around central fires where groups would gather. Architecture itself suggests social structure. And laughter. We carry laughter in our bones. The capacity for humour, for play, for the release of tension through shared mirth. Young Neanderthals and Homo sapiens played, learned through mock combat and games. Adults surely found moments of levity even in harsh circumstances. Because humour is a survival mechanism too. It diffuses conflict, strengthens bonds, provides psychological relief from danger and difficulty. These people weren't grim, joyless automatons grinding through existence. They were humans, with a full range of human emotional experience. They knew friendship, they knew companionship, they knew the comfort of not being alone, and they knew compassion, perhaps the most remarkable evidence of all. In Iraq, archaeologists uncovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who died around 50,000 years ago. He was elderly by Paleolithic standards, probably in his 40s, and his body tells a striking story. He had suffered a catastrophic injury years before his death, a crushing blow to the left side of his head that destroyed his eye socket and likely blinded him. His right arm had been amputated at the elbow, long enough before death that the bone had healed. He had severe arthritis. Tooth wear suggests he had difficulty chewing. This man couldn't hunt. He couldn't craft tools with any efficiency. He couldn't gather food effectively. By every measure of raw survival value, he was a burden. And yet he lived years after his injuries. He survived into old age. He survived because others cared for him, because his community fed him, protected him, valued him enough to keep him alive despite the cost. This is profound. This is evidence of a moral framework, of social bonds that transcend utility. This man had value not because of what he could do, but because of who he was. Perhaps a respected elder, perhaps simply someone loved. This pattern appears again and again. At multiple Neanderthal sites, we find individuals with healed fractures, with disabilities that would have prevented independent survival, with evidence of long-term care. The same appears among Homo sapiens. A child with severe developmental disabilities who lived to age 5 or 6, requiring constant care. An elderly individual with no teeth remaining, who would have needed food specially prepared, pre-chewed or cooked to softness, in order to eat. These aren't aberrations. This is evidence of systematic compassion, of communities that chose to care for the vulnerable rather than abandoning them. And that choice, that decision to value individuals beyond their productive capacity, that's humanity in its purest form. So what do we make of all this? The art, the music, the burials, the care. We're looking at minds that experienced the world much as we do. They felt wonder at beauty. They experienced grief at loss. They knew love, fear, anger, joy. They looked up at stars and asked questions. They felt the weight of mortality and created rituals to manage that knowledge. They bonded with their children, mourned their dead, celebrated their victories, endured their defeats. The cognitive distance between us and them is vanishingly small. If you could transport an infant from 100,000 years ago into the present, raise them in a modern family, they'd be indistinguishable from any other person. They'd learn to read, use computers, understand calculus, appreciate music, fall in love. Because the hardware was already there. The capacity for language, abstraction, empathy, creativity, all fully formed. What's changed isn't our fundamental nature. It's our accumulated culture, the vast library of knowledge and technique and story passed down across 5,000 generations. But that process of accumulation, that started here, in these moments when our ancestors first carved patterns into ochre, first strung beads together, first buried their dead with ceremony, first told stories that weren't literally true but were true in deeper ways. This is when humanity, in the fullest sense of that word, began. Not when we stood upright, not when we made the first tool, not even when we achieved our modern anatomy, but when we created meaning, when we looked at existence and decided it wasn't enough to simply survive. We needed to understand, to explain, to express, to connect. When we became creatures who asked why, not just how. That's the threshold we're examining here, and we didn't cross it alone. Multiple human species show evidence of symbolic thought, of culture, of the search for meaning, which makes the next part of our story, the part where only one species remains, even more haunting. But for now, in this moment 100,000 years ago, several kinds of humans walk the earth, and all of them, in their own ways, are asking the same fundamental questions. Creating art, honouring the dead, building culture, all of them reaching towards something beyond the immediate, something eternal, all of them human in the ways that matter most. Let's do something different now. For the past hour or so, we've been zooming out, looking at the sweep of continents, the architecture of stone tools, the symbolic weight of painted caves. We've talked about evolution and extinction, culture and cognition, all of it necessary, all of it true. But here's what gets lost in that kind of narrative, the texture of an actual day. Because 100,000 years ago, no one was thinking about their place in the archaeological record. No one knew they were living through the middle Paleolithic. They woke up cold, they felt hunger, they laughed at something we'll never understand. They stubbed a toe on a rock and cursed in a language that left no echo. So let's pull the camera in close. Let's walk through a single day, not as scholars, but as shadows. We'll follow a small band of Homo sapiens, somewhere in what we now call Southern Africa, though the name means nothing to them. It's summer in their world. The rains have passed. The land is golden and green and alive. This won't be perfect. We're guessing at details, filling gaps with evidence from bone chemistry, toolware patterns, modern hunter-gatherer analogues, and the stubborn residue of ancient campsites. But it's an educated guess, a reconstruction built on decades of careful science. And if we're lucky, it might feel real. The world is still dark when the first person stirs. Not pitch black. There's a thin wash of pre-dawn grey bleeding into the eastern sky, just enough to separate earth from air. The fire at the centre of the camp has burned down to embers, a sullen red glow beneath a layer of ash. It's cold. Not freezing, but that bone-deep chill that seeps through hide and skin when you've been lying still for hours. A woman, let's call her that, though she has no name we could pronounce, shifts under the antelope skin draped across her body. She doesn't leap up. There's no alarm clock, no rigid schedule, but her body knows. The rhythm of sleep and waking is written into her muscles, her gut, the dim, pre-conscious awareness that dawn is the safest time to move. She sits up slowly, careful not to wake the child curled against her side. Around her, the camp is a loose constellation of shelters, simple frames of bent branches covered in hides and woven grass. Low to the ground, open on one side to face the fire. Practical, portable. You don't build monuments when you might need to leave in 3 days. Other shapes are stirring now. An older man, his joints stiff, eases himself upright with a barely audible grunt. A younger woman steps out from her shelter, stretches, glances toward the horizon. No one speaks yet. The quiet is communal, almost sacred, a shared acknowledgement that the world is still waking up. The fire needs attention first. Always the fire. The woman kneels beside the embers, her movements practised and precise. She brushes away the ash layer with a flat stick, exposing the hot coals beneath. A few dry grass stems, a handful of thin twigs. She leans in close, blowing gently, steadily, coaxing the heat into flame. Smoke curls up, sharp and clean. The twigs catch. She adds larger sticks, building the structure carefully. Fire is life, and life requires attention. As the flames grow, warmth spreads through the camp. Others drift toward it, drawn by instinct and comfort. The cold retreats. The day begins. The morning routine unfolds with a rhythm that looks effortless, but is actually the result of hundreds of small practiced decisions. The older man, grey-haired, lean, maybe 50 if he's lucky, checks his tools. He pulls a leather pouch from his shelter and spreads its contents on a flat stone. 3 hand axes, a bone awl, a hafted knife with a flake blade lashed to a wooden handle with sinew. He examines each one, running his thumb along the edges, testing for chips or dullness. The knife needs work. He'll sharpen it later. Near the fire, 2 younger men are talking in low voices, gesturing toward the hills to the north. One of them mimes the shape of horns with his hands. Antelope, maybe, or some other mid-sized ungulate. They're planning, debating. One points to the sky, reading the light, estimating how much time they have before the heat becomes oppressive. A hunting party is forming. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fire, the gathering party is organising itself. This is not a gendered division born of inequality. It's strategic optimization. Hunting requires speed, endurance, and the ability to travel light. Gathering requires knowledge, patience, and the capacity to carry weight. Both are essential. Both demand expertise. The woman who woke first is part of this group. So is an older woman, her face deeply lined, her hands gnarled but sure. 2 adolescent girls. A young mother with an infant strapped to her back in a sling of soft hide. And 3 children, ranging from maybe 5 to 10 years old, already learning the landscape through their feet and eyes. They carry woven baskets, tight weaved grass containers that took hours to make, digging sticks with fire-hardened tips, leather pouches. Their tools are simple, but don't mistake simplicity for crudeness. These are instruments of profound botanical and ecological knowledge. Because here's the thing, gathering isn't passive. It's not wandering around picking berries like some Paleolithic picnic. It's systematized expertise. The sun clears the horizon as the 2 groups prepare to leave. The hunters move first. 4 men carrying spears with stone points, hafted knives, and nothing else. They travel fast and light. Their plan is simple. Move north toward a seasonal waterhole where game has been spotted in recent days. Read the signs, track whatever looks promising, and, if the ancestors smile, bring meat home before dark. They don't say goodbye. There's a brief moment of eye contact with the rest of the camp, a nod, and then they're gone, jogging steadily into the golden grassland, their bodies lean and efficient, their footfalls nearly silent. The gathering party leaves a few minutes later, heading west toward a rocky hillside where certain plants grow. Their pace is different, slower, more deliberate, punctuated by conversation and the light chatter of children. Let's follow them. Within half an hour, they've covered maybe 2 miles, climbing gradually into terrain thick with acacia trees and low scrub. The older woman stops frequently, scanning the ground, occasionally kneeling to examine a plant or turn over a rock. The others watch, learn, ask questions. She points to a cluster of small tubers barely visible beneath the soil. One of the girls digs carefully with her stick, loosening the earth, extracting the root without breaking it. It's the size of a fist, pale and fibrous. Not much to look at, but it's dense with carbohydrates and it stores well. She places it in her basket. 50 feet away, the young mother has found a termite mound. She kneels, studying the entrance holes, then carefully breaks off a thin twig and strips the leaves. She inserts it into a hole, wiggles it gently, waits. When she pulls it out, it's covered in soldier termites, clinging to the wood with their mandibles. She scrapes them into her pouch. Protein, fat, calories that cost almost no energy to acquire. This is the hidden brilliance of Paleolithic life, the ability to read a landscape as a living text. Every plant, every insect, every pattern of bird flight or shift in wind direction is information. The older woman knows which roots are edible and which will kill you. She knows which berries ripen first after the rains, which trees host beetle larvae, where to find ostrich eggs, how to identify the scat of a hyena versus a leopard, and what that tells you about whether it's safe to linger. This knowledge isn't written down. It's not taught in a single lesson. It's embedded in stories, in songs, in the patient repetition of 1,000 small observations passed from grandmother to mother to daughter across generations. The children learn by doing. They make mistakes, eating a bitter root, misidentifying a track. They're corrected gently, persistently. There's no formal curriculum, but the education is rigorous and life-dependent. By mid-morning the baskets are half full. Tubers, nuts, wild plums, handfuls of seeds, a clutch of bird eggs wrapped carefully in grass. The work is hard, digging, climbing, bending, carrying, but there's also laughter. Someone makes a joke. One of the younger girls tries to mimic the call of a bird and gets it hilariously wrong. The infant fusses, is soothed, falls back asleep against his mother's back. They rest in the shade of a baobab tree, passing around a leather pouch of water, chewing on dried meat from yesterday's kill, and for a few minutes there's peace. Meanwhile the hunters are tracking. They found prints an hour ago, a small herd of springbok, maybe 6 or 7 individuals moving east toward higher ground. The tracks are fresh, no more than 2 hours old. The moisture in the disturbed soil hasn't fully evaporated yet. They move in a loose line, reading the ground, communicating with gestures and the occasional low whistle. One of them spots a tuft of fur caught on a thorn bush. Another notices the way the grass is bent, not by wind, but by the passage of bodies. This is cognitive work of staggering complexity. They're reconstructing a narrative from fragments, predicting behaviour, anticipating movement patterns based on season, time of day, terrain, and water availability. It's detective work, it's science, it's art, and it's also intensely physical. They've been jogging on and off for hours now. Their breathing is controlled, rhythmic, their legs burn, sweat drips from their brows, but they don't stop. Because here's the thing about persistence hunting, the technique Homo sapiens perfected on the African savannah. We're not the fastest, we're not the strongest, but we can outlast almost anything. By midday, they've closed the distance. The springbok are visible now, grazing on a slope about half a mile ahead. The hunters stop, crouch low and confer in whispers. The wind is in their favour. The terrain offers some cover. If they can get within 50 yards, they have a chance. 2 of them circle wide to the left. The other 2 stay put, waiting. Then, coordinated movement. The 2 on the left rise and sprint, yelling, waving their arms. The springbok bolt predictably to the right, where the other 2 hunters are waiting, spears raised. It happens fast. One of the springboks stumbles on uneven ground. A spear flies. It strikes the animal's flank, not a killing blow, but enough to slow it. The hunters converge. The second spear. A third. The animal goes down. There's no triumph in their faces, no celebration, just focus, respect. One of them kneels beside the dying springbok and places a hand on its neck, murmuring something too quiet to hear. A prayer, maybe, an acknowledgement. Life feeding life. They don't waste time. The carcass needs to be processed quickly. Scavengers are everywhere, and hyenas can smell blood from miles away. They work with practiced efficiency. Stone blades cut through hide, joints are disarticulated, organs are removed and wrapped carefully. The liver, the kidneys, the heart. These are the most nutrient-dense parts, reserved for the elders and the children. By early afternoon, they're heading back, carrying meat, hide, and bone, the spoils of a successful hunt distributed evenly among them. Back at camp, the gathering party has returned. The baskets are emptied onto flat stones, and the older woman begins sorting. Some plants need to be processed immediately. Roots pounded into paste, seeds roasted, greens wilted over the fire. Others can wait. Children are everywhere, underfoot and curious. One of the adolescent boys is learning to knap stone under the watchful eye of the grey-haired man. He strikes a core with a hammerstone and a flake pops off. Too thick, the angle wrong. The older man doesn't criticise. He just picks up the flake, turns it over, shows the boy where the fracture went wrong, and hands him another stone. Try again. Nearby, 2 women are scraping the inside of an antelope hide with sharp-edged stones, removing fat and tissue, preparing it for tanning. It's tedious work. Their hands will ache by evening, but the hide will become clothing, a shelter cover, a carrying pouch. Nothing is wasted. Someone has started a stew. Chunks of dried meat simmering in a hide-lined pit filled with water heated by fire-hot stones. The smell is rich and savoury, mingling with the smoke and the warm afternoon air, and then the hunters return. There's a shift in the camp's energy, subtle but real. People look up, smiles appear. The hunters are greeted not with fanfare but with quiet satisfaction. The meat is distributed. The hide is handed over to the women who know how to work it. The children crowd around, asking questions, touching the bones, imagining themselves in the hunt. The older woman takes the liver and begins slicing it into portions. This will be shared tonight, around the fire with everyone. As the sun begins its descent, the rhythm of the camp shifts again. The intensity of the day's labour gives way to something slower, more social. People gather in loose clusters. Some are still working, sharpening tools, weaving baskets, nursing infants. But the urgency is gone. Conversations unfold in the golden light, punctuated by laughter and the occasional argument. One of the young men is carving a piece of bone, maybe a bead, maybe a pendant. His hands are steady, the incisions precise. It's not strictly necessary. It's not food or shelter or fire, but it's beautiful. And beauty, it turns out, is also survival. It's the mark of a mind capable of abstraction, of seeing beyond the immediate, of caring about more than just the next meal. The fire is built up again as dusk approaches. This is the heart of Paleolithic life, the fire as gathering place, as source of warmth and light and safety. People drift toward it as the sky turns orange, then purple, then deep blue. The stew is ready. Portions are ladled into wooden bowls, onto flat stones, directly into waiting hands. There's no formal seating, no hierarchy of place. People sit where there's space, eat with their fingers, chew slowly, savour the fat and salt and warmth. And then, as the stars emerge, someone begins to sing. It's a low rhythmic chant, wordless at first, then joined by another voice, then another. A pattern emerges, melody, hands clap, feet tap. The fire crackles in time. This is not entertainment in the modern sense, it's not performance, it's communion. The stories come next. The older man speaks, his voice rough but clear, and the camp listens. He tells of a hunt from his youth, of a lion that stalked them for 3 days, of the moment when his father drove it off with nothing but a spear and a shout. The children sit wide-eyed. The adults nod, recognizing the shape of the story, the moral embedded in its structure. Another person adds a memory, then another. The conversation weaves through the group, stitching together individual experience into collective history. This is how culture persists. This is how knowledge moves through time, not through writing, not through books or recordings or archives, through voices, through repetition, through the simple act of sitting together in the dark and remembering aloud. Eventually the fire burns low again, voices quiet, yawns spread like contagion. One by one, people drift back to their shelters, pulling hides over themselves, curling close to children and partners for warmth. The woman who woke first lies down in the same spot she left this morning. The child is already asleep beside her. She pulls the antelope skin over them both and stares up at the sky. The stars are impossibly bright. No light pollution, no atmospheric haze, just the naked cosmos blazing overhead. The Milky Way stretches like a river of light. She doesn't know the names we've given those stars, doesn't know their distant suns, but she knows their patterns. She knows which ones mark the seasons. She knows how to navigate by them. Somewhere in the distance a hyena laughs, a sound like madness, eerie and unsettling. Closer a nightbird calls. The fire hisses softly, settling into coals. And here, in this moment, is the vulnerability at the core of Paleolithic life. Sleep is surrender, to close your eyes in a world full of predators, in the dark with only fire and flimsy shelters between you and everything that hunts. It requires trust. Trust in the people around you. Trust that someone will wake if danger approaches. Trust that the group will defend itself, will protect the vulnerable, will not abandon you in the night. This is the invisible architecture of human survival. Not just tools or fire or language, but the profound, radical act of trusting each other enough to sleep. The woman closes her eyes, her breathing slows, and the day ends as it began, in darkness, in quiet, in the fragile, beautiful persistence of life. So what have we just witnessed? A day that is, in many ways, unimaginable to us. A day without clocks or calendars, without electricity or engines, without any of the scaffolding we've built between ourselves and the raw world. But also a day that is deeply, recognisably human. Because beneath the unfamiliar surface, the stone tools, the hide shelters, the hunted meat and gathered roots, there's a rhythm we still know. Work and rest. Effort and reward. Solitude and community. The teaching of children. The care for elders. The laughter and the stories and the quiet moments of beauty. These people were not primitive in the sense we often imagine. They were not brutish or stupid or barely more than animals. They were us. Their brains were the same size as ours. Their capacity for abstract thought, for planning, for creativity, for love and grief and wonder, all of it was already there, fully formed 100,000 years ago. What they lacked was time. Time to accumulate knowledge. Time to build on the innovations of previous generations. Time to develop the technologies and systems that would eventually allow some of their descendants to sit in climate-controlled rooms and talk about them through glowing screens. But in terms of raw capability, in terms of intelligence and adaptability and the fundamental human spark, they were our equals. And their daily life, this constant negotiation between danger and beauty, between survival and meaning, this was the crucible in which everything we are was forged. The patience to nap a stone blade for an hour, the generosity to share meat with the group, the curiosity to wonder what lies beyond the next hill, the courage to sleep under the stars and trust you'll wake again. All of it, woven into a single day, repeated across thousands of days, across thousands of generations, until, somehow, improbably, we arrived here. And the question that lingers as we pull back from this single day, as we zoom out again and return to the sweep of history, is this: if they were us, and we are them, what happened to everyone else? Because 100,000 years ago there were 6 human species walking the earth. Now there's only one. Picture a world growing quieter. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence. Of voices that once called across valleys now gone. Of fires that once burned in caves from Iberia to Siberia, now cold. Of footprints left in mud that will fossilise alone, with no one following behind. By 30,000 years ago, something had fundamentally changed. The crowded world we explored earlier, that mosaic of human species sharing continents, sometimes territories, perhaps even campsites, had collapsed into singularity. The Neanderthals, who had endured ice ages for 300,000 years, vanished from their final refuges in Gibraltar and Croatia. The Denisovans, those mysterious inhabitants of Asia's vastness, disappeared from the archaeological record. The last of Homo erectus, the most successful human species in history, flickered out on distant islands. Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Flores, left no descendants. One by one, the other chapters of the human story came to an end, and we, Homo sapiens, remained. Alone, the only human species walking the earth for the first time in millions of years. This is not a triumph. This is a mystery, and it's one that haunts every study of our origins, every excavation, every genome sequenced from ancient bone. Because the question isn't just academic curiosity. The question is fundamental. Why did everyone else disappear? And perhaps more unsettling, could we have prevented it? The simplest answer, the one that dominated thinking for decades, is competition. The hypothesis goes like this. Homo sapiens possessed something, some edge, some advantage, that made us better survivors than our cousins. When we encountered other human species, we didn't just coexist. We outcompeted them, out-hunted them, out-reproduced them. We were faster, smarter, more adaptable. They fell behind. They diminished. They vanished. It's a narrative that fits neatly with certain ideas about evolution. Survival of the fittest. Natural selection is a zero-sum game. One species rising necessarily means another falling. But here's where it gets complicated. What exactly was our advantage? Some researchers point to technology, and it's true that Homo sapiens developed innovations that appear earlier and more widely in our toolkit than in others. The atlatl, the spear thrower that increased hunting range, bone needles that enabled sewn clothing, crucial for surviving northern winters, elaborate blade technologies that produced more cutting edge from less stone, fishing hooks, rope, snares. These weren't just tools, they were force multipliers. A Homo sapiens hunter with an atlatl could kill prey from a safe distance that a Neanderthal with a thrusting spear had to approach at lethal proximity. A Homo sapiens group with sewn, fitted clothing could range further north, hunt in worse weather, expand into territories their cousins couldn't comfortably inhabit. Over time, and we're talking thousands of years, hundreds of generations, these advantages compound. Better tools mean more successful hunts. More successful hunts mean healthier children. Healthier children mean larger populations. Larger populations mean more innovation, more variation, more chances for the next breakthrough. Meanwhile, populations without these advantages face the opposite spiral. Marginally less successful hunts, slightly higher child mortality, slowly shrinking numbers, less innovation, greater vulnerability. Is not dramatic, no single battle, no apocalyptic confrontation, just the slow mathematics of survival, tilting incrementally, but inexorably in one direction. But technology alone doesn't tell the whole story. Because Neanderthals weren't technologically primitive. They made beautiful, sophisticated stone tools. They used fire with mastery. They created birch tar adhesive through a process requiring precise temperature control. Essentially, they had chemistry. Some evidence suggests they had art, ornaments, symbolic thought. So perhaps the advantage wasn't tools, but minds. Social organisation, the ability to cooperate in larger groups, to maintain alliances across greater distances, to share information more fluidly. There's a theory, proposed by anthropologist Robin Dunbar, that suggests there's a cognitive limit to the number of stable relationships a human can maintain, around 150 people, the so-called Dunbar's number. And while this number might seem arbitrary, it reflects something real about the mental overhead of tracking social bonds, obligations, hierarchies and trust. What if Homo sapiens could manage slightly larger networks, could maintain cohesion in groups of 175 or 200? The advantage might seem small, but in the Paleolithic, information was survival. Knowing where herds migrated, which valleys flooded in spring, where flint deposits lay, which plants were edible, which strangers could be trusted. A species that could network across a dozen bands instead of 3 or 4 would have access to exponentially more knowledge, more territory understood, more resources located, more genetic diversity to prevent inbreeding, more people to weather disasters. In this light, sociality becomes weaponry, not because Homo sapiens were more aggressive, but because we were more connected. And yet, climate might have been the true executioner, because while we're discussing competition and advantage, the planet was convulsing through changes that make our current climate crisis look gentle by comparison. The period between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago saw some of the most violent climate fluctuations of the entire Ice Age. Temperatures could shift by 10 degrees Celsius within a human lifetime. Ecosystems would transform, a forest becoming steppe becoming tundra within decades. Animal populations, the reindeer, the bison, the mammoth that Paleolithic peoples depended on, would migrate, diminish, or locally vanish. For a species barely hanging on, adapted to specific regions and resources, these fluctuations were existential threats. And here's the bitter mathematics. The species already suffering from smaller populations, from restricted territories, from marginally lower birth rates, they were the most vulnerable. Think of it like this. A population of 500 individuals weathering a bad decade, a drought, a failed migration, a harsh winter, might lose 100 people. Devastating, but survivable. They recover. But a population of 5,000 losing 100 people? Barely a setback. They barely notice. When climate shocks hit repeatedly, as they did during this period, species with smaller populations enter what ecologists call an extinction vortex. Each shock reduces numbers. Reduced numbers mean less genetic diversity. Less diversity means lower adaptability. Lower adaptability means higher vulnerability to the next shock, and on and down. It's possible, likely even, that many populations of Neanderthals, Denisovans and others were already in decline before Homo sapiens arrived in significant numbers. Hey, we didn't cause their fall. We simply filled the spaces they left empty. But then there's the twist. The revelation that changed everything we thought we knew about human extinction. They didn't disappear completely. Parts of them survive. In us. In the early 2000s, when scientists first sequenced the Neanderthal genome from ancient DNA, they made a discovery that rewrote the story. Humans of non-African descent carry Neanderthal DNA. Between 1 and 4% of our genome comes directly from interbreeding events between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, probably in the Middle East between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, when our ancestors first left Africa. Later we found Denisovan DNA, up to 6% in modern Melanesians, Australian Aboriginals, and some Asian populations. Evidence of interbreeding in multiple locations, multiple times. And here's what this means. The story of us versus them collapses. There was no clean separation. When Homo sapiens met Neanderthals, we didn't just fight them, or outcompete them, or accidentally doom them through disease. We also, at least sometimes in some places, loved them, mated with them, had children together. And those children survived, thrived, passed on their mixed heritage through thousands of generations down to you and me. This is the interbreeding hypothesis, and it changes the question entirely. Did Neanderthals go extinct? Or were they absorbed? Did they disappear? Or do they live on, their genes woven into ours? Some of those archaic genes aren't just relics, they're functional. We've identified Neanderthal DNA sequences involved in immune response, our ability to fight certain pathogens, skin and hair pigmentation, altitude adaptation in Tibetan populations inherited from Denisovans, genes that help us survive at elevations where oxygen is scarce. These aren't random inheritances. These are survival adaptations that Neanderthals and Denisovans evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in Eurasia, genes that helped them endure ice ages and harsh environments. When Homo sapiens arrived in these territories, we were newcomers, they were natives, and by interbreeding we essentially downloaded their locally adapted survival software. In a very real sense, we didn't replace Neanderthals, we became them, partially, incompletely, but undeniably. Still, this doesn't explain the disappearance, because even accounting for interbreeding, distinct Neanderthal populations, recognizable as such, cease to exist. The archaeological record ends. The unique morphology, culture and lifeways fade from evidence. So even if they live on genetically, something was still lost. What else contributed to the decline? Disease is an uncomfortable possibility. When isolated populations meet after millennia of separation, they carry different pathogens. Diseases evolved in Africa alongside Homo sapiens might have been harmless to us, but lethal to Neanderthals who'd never encountered them. It's what happened when Europeans reached the Americas. Entire indigenous populations decimated by smallpox, measles, influenza. Not because those populations were weak, but because they'd never evolved immunity. Could Homo sapiens have been a vector for pandemic among archaic humans? It's possible, but the evidence is nearly impossible to find. Diseases don't fossilize. We can't detect ancient viruses in bone. All we have is speculation and the grim logic of epidemiology. Violence is another candidate, and let's not romanticize either species. Humans, all humans, are capable of astonishing cruelty. Territorial, tribal. We know that Homo sapiens committed violence against each other. Mass graves, traumatic injuries, evidence of warfare appear repeatedly in the archaeological record. Why would encounters with other species be any different? There are hints. Neanderthal remains showing trauma that might be from human weapons. A skull from Shanidar Cave with a wound that matches stone projectile points. But the evidence is ambiguous. Was this warfare? Isolated conflict? An accident? We don't know. We can't know. What's likely is that violence wasn't systematic genocide, but something more banal. Periodic conflict over territory and resources, a valley with good hunting grounds, a cave site, a water source. If two bands, one Homo sapiens, one Neanderthal, both depended on the same territory, and if climate changes made that territory scarce, conflict would be inevitable. And if, over time, those conflicts slightly favoured the Homo sapiens groups, whether through superior weapons, larger numbers or better organisation, the outcome would be gradual displacement, not extermination, not intentional extinction, just the slow accumulation of losses. Then there's demography. Population size matters, not just for weathering disasters, but for long-term genetic viability. Small populations face inbreeding, genetic bottlenecks, the accumulation of harmful mutations that can't be purged through natural selection. Recent genetic analyses suggest that many Neanderthal populations were tiny, perhaps a few thousand individuals across vast territories, and not just small, but fragmented. Isolated groups cut off from each other by mountain ranges, glaciers, climate zones. These isolated populations would have been exquisitely vulnerable to random chance. A bad hunting season, a disease outbreak, a landslide. Any single catastrophe might wipe out an entire band. And if that band represented one of the few remaining reproductive populations, their extinction brings the whole species closer to oblivion. Homo sapiens, by contrast, appear to have maintained larger, more interconnected populations, more genetic diversity, more resilience to random shocks. It's not that we were necessarily better. We were more numerous, and in the mathematics of survival, that matters enormously. But here's something we often overlook in the narrative of disappearance: cultural transmission. The possibility that before they vanished, other human species taught us. We know there's temporal overlap. We know there's interbreeding. We also know that sometimes, in the archaeological record, we see sudden appearances of new technologies in Homo sapiens sites right after contact with Neanderthals or Denisovans. Better hafting techniques for spear points, particular styles of ornament, symbolic behaviours. Did we learn from them? Did Neanderthals teach Homo sapiens how to survive northern winters, how to hunt woolly rhinoceros, how to find shelter in landscapes we'd never encountered? Did Denisovans show us routes through Siberia, technologies for surviving cold we couldn't have independently invented? If so, then the disappearance becomes even more complex, because it means the archaic humans didn't just contribute genes, they contributed knowledge, skills, culture. The very adaptations that allowed Homo sapiens to succeed in their former territories might have been gifts, intentional or not, from the species we were, replacing. And that inheritance, genetic and cultural, makes the loss more poignant. Because what vanished wasn't just populations, it was entire ways of being human. Think about what we've lost. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, possibly larger in some dimensions. They had culture, language, almost certainly, though we'll never hear it. They made art. They cared for their injured and elderly. We have skeletons showing healed fractures that would have required months of immobility, meaning others fed and protected them. They buried their dead, sometimes with flowers, with pigments, with care that speaks to something we can only call love. What did they think? What stories did they tell around fires in caves we've excavated empty? What songs did they sing? What jokes did they make? What fears kept them awake? What hopes sustained them? We'll never know. Those inner lives, as real, as rich, as complex as ours, are silent forever. Not just lost, but unrecoverable. The Denisovans are even more ghostly. We have a few bone fragments, a tooth, a finger bone. From these scraps we've reconstructed entire genomes, traced their migrations across Asia, identified their offspring in our DNA. But we don't know what they looked like, don't have a single skull, can't reconstruct their face, their posture, their gait. They're more present in genetic databases than in physical reality, and the others, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, the unnamed archaic humans whose DNA hints appear in African populations, they're even fainter. Traces of traces, entire lineages, entire evolutionary experiments in what it means to be human. Millions of years of adaptation, of survival, of change, gone, leaving only echoes. But here's the thing. Here's what we need to understand. We are those echoes. Every person of non-African descent carries Neanderthal genes. Every person of Melanesian descent carries Denisovan genes. We're not pure Homo sapiens. We never were. We're hybrids, mosaics. The living legacy of multiple human species blended into one. That gene that helps you fight off flu might be Neanderthal. That adaptation that helps your blood carry oxygen at high altitude, Denisovan. We are, quite literally, the inheritors of all these lineages, not their conquerors, not their replacements, their children. And beyond genetics, there's knowledge. Every technique we learned from another species, every route they showed us, every survival strategy we copied, these are inheritances too. The technology that allowed Homo sapiens to spread from Africa to Tierra del Fuego, from the Arctic to Australia, didn't emerge from us alone. It was cumulative, built on the discoveries of everyone who came before. So when we ask why only we remain, perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps no one remains alone. Perhaps we're all that's left, but we're left carrying everyone who came before. The disappearance of other human species isn't a mystery with one answer. It's a convergence of factors, each tilting probability slightly, compounding over millennia. Better technology, yes. Larger populations, probably. Climate shocks, certainly. Interbreeding and absorption, demonstrably. Disease, possibly. Violence, occasionally. Random chance, inevitably. No single cause, no simple villain, just the brutal mathematics of survival, operating over timescales that defy intuition. But what remains, us, is not separate from what was lost. We are the continuation, the synthesis, the surviving branch of a tree that once spread wide with many limbs, all of them human, all of them reaching toward the same sun. When you look in the mirror, you're not seeing a pure species, you're seeing a coalition, an alliance of lineages that chose to blend rather than remain separate. And in your DNA, in your immune system, in your adaptations to altitude or cold or disease, are the survival strategies of humans you'll never meet, from species you'll never see, who vanished from the earth 30,000 years ago, but didn't disappear, because they became us, and we carry them still into whatever future awaits, bearing the resilience of all the human species who walked before, their tools in our hands, their genes in our cells, their fire somehow still burning in the dark. And now we return, from 100,000 years ago, from the smoke of ancient fires and the shadow of vanished glaciers, from handprints pressed into cave walls by fingers that felt warmth and cold just as ours do. We come back to the present moment, to wherever you are right now, your room, your bed, the glow of your screen in the darkness, the sounds of the modern world humming quietly around you. We've travelled together through an ocean of time, through 5 extinctions and 1,000,000 generations, through ice ages and interglacial springs, through landscapes that no longer exist and alongside people who walked upright, who spoke, who loved, who buried their dead with flowers and who are gone. What have we learned? That resilience is not a modern invention. That creativity flickered in human minds long before cities rose or alphabets were carved. That the capacity for meaning, for art, for ritual, for remembering, did not emerge suddenly in one lineage, but bloomed in different species in different ways across the breadth of human diversity. We learned that Neanderthals were not the brutish caricatures of old textbooks. They were healers. They were artists. They cared for their injured, their elderly. They adorned themselves with eagle talons and red ochre. They stood on cliff sides and watched the same stars we see now, pondering mysteries we can only imagine. We learned that Denisovans, known to us only through fragments and whispers in our DNA, climbed mountains we still cannot easily reach, and adapted to environments that would kill us today. That they met us, mingled with us, and left their mark not in monuments, but in our blood. We learned that Homo heidelbergensis built shelters 500,000 years ago, that Homo erectus mastered fire before our species even existed, that tool-making, the deliberate shaping of the world to meet our needs, is a heritage older than we are. And we learned that 100,000 years ago the world was not dominated by Homo sapiens, it was shared. 6 human species walking the same earth, each solving the problem of survival in their own way, each carrying their own culture, their own knowledge, their own spark. Only one remains. But here's what matters most. The people of 100,000 years ago are not alien to us. They are not some distant, incomprehensible other. They are us, separated only by time. Every fear they felt in the darkness, we have felt. Every joy they experienced at the sight of a child's first steps, we have experienced. Every moment of wonder they had, staring up at the night sky, we have had. Their hearts beat at the same rhythm as ours. Their brains fired with the same electrical patterns of thought and memory. Their hands, whether Neanderthal or sapiens or Denisovan, held the same capacity for gentleness and violence, creation and destruction. We are them, continued. We are the thread that did not break. And yet, so much remains mystery. So much we will never know. We will never hear their voices, never know the exact cadence of their languages, the jokes they told around fires, the songs they sang to their children. We will never know what stories they told about the moon, what names they gave to the wind, what dreams woke them in the night. We find their handprints, but not the reasons they placed them there. We find their graves, but not the words spoken over them. We find evidence of meetings between species, Neanderthals and sapiens sharing the same caves, but we don't know if those meetings were peaceful exchanges or tense standoffs, romances or conflicts, collaborations or competitions. The archaeological record is a vast silence punctuated by fragments. For every stone tool we find, 1,000 more have eroded into dust. For every skeleton preserved, 10,000 dissolved into the earth without a trace. For every painted cave discovered, how many more lie hidden, or have already crumbled away? There are entire lives, entire peoples, who left no mark we can read, who walked across landscapes that are now ocean floors, who built shelters from materials that decomposed millennia ago, who told stories that evaporated with their last breath. We do the best we can with what remains. We reconstruct, we analyse, we compare, we imagine. But in the end, we are visitors at a door that will never fully open. We are reading a book with most of its pages torn out, trying to piece together the story from fragments and context and educated guesses. And perhaps that's all right. Perhaps mystery is part of the inheritance. Perhaps it's enough to know that they existed, that they lived full, complex, meaningful lives, even if we can never know those lives in detail. Because here's what we do know, beyond doubt. We are the descendants of survivors. Every single person alive today carries 100,000 years of endurance in their bones. You carry it. I carry it. The DNA winding through your cells right now has been tested by ice ages and droughts, by migrations across continents, by diseases and famines and predators and catastrophes that would stagger the imagination. Your ancestors, our ancestors, watched the world change around them and adapted. When the ice came, they moved. When the megafauna disappeared, they learned to hunt smaller game. When territories became crowded, they developed new tools, new strategies, new forms of cooperation. They didn't have antibiotics or agriculture or written language. They had ingenuity, they had community, they had each other, and it was enough. Not always. Not for every individual, not for every group. Not for the Neanderthals or Denisovans or the other species who walked beside us. But for one unbroken lineage, the one that leads directly to you, it was enough. You exist because thousands of generations ago someone survived a winter that should have killed them. Someone crossed a river that should have drowned them. Someone fought off an infection, escaped a predator, found food in a barren landscape, made it through one more day and then another until they could pass life forward. You are the result of an unbroken chain stretching back through deep time. You are not separate from that story. You are its continuation, its living page, its newest chapter, and that's worth remembering. If this journey has meant something to you, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a like if you can. It helps others find this story. Subscribe if you'd like to take more journeys like this one through time and space and the strange beauty of our shared past. And here's something I'm genuinely curious about. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. What city, what country, what corner of the world? Because right now, in this moment, we're scattered across the globe, connected through light and sound and story in a way our ancestors could never have imagined. We're creating our own kind of continuity, a community separated by space, united by curiosity about time. Thank you for being here, for spending this time with me, for choosing to remember, to wonder, to sit with the vastness of what came before us, for caring about people who have been dust for millennia but who are in some essential way still us. Rest well wherever you are. Dream, if you like, of deep time, of long migrations and distant fires, of 6 human species sharing one world, each trying to make sense of their place in it. And when you wake, carry this story with you. Carry the knowledge that you are made of stardust and survival, that your lineage stretches back through the Paleolithic into the very origins of what it means to be human. Carry the understanding that resilience is your birthright, that creativity is in your blood, that the capacity for meaning, for art, for connection, for hope has been with us from the very beginning. And maybe, just maybe, carry a little more gentleness for this improbable, beautiful, difficult existence we all share. We are all children of the Paleolithic, all descendants of the world before memory, all carriers of a story, 100,000 years in the telling. Good night, and thank you for remembering with me.